morning and welcome back to the lecture series. So today we are going to start with a new topic, magical realism. Let's try to look at the provenance, the historical background of magical realism. Where from did magical realism churn out? What led to the magical realism? And after understanding the historical background, what preceded and what kind of provoked this new movement in art, in literature, we are going to also we are also going to discuss in detail what magical realism is. So, in 1925, German art critic Franz Roh coined this term magical realism for the first time in reference to a new postmodern artistic tendency, and he saw this tendency appearing first in European painting, which replaced the Expressionist movement. So, we have to understand that magical realism was preceded by Expressionism in art in the European milieu, in the European scenario. So, in the term magical realism, Franz Roh is intending to use magic as opposed to mystic or abstract, and he suggests here that mystery does not manifest clarity to the represented world, but in fact hides the reality from the represented world. So, moreover, we see that Roh chooses the term magical realism instead of post-expressionism, because when we say pre or post to a certain movement, we in a way say that there is a disjuncture, but also certain overlaps. He wanted to signify in fact that there is a conscious departure from expressionism and hence not post-expressionism. He believes that post-expressionism kind of shows, like I said, a chronological relationship with the expressionist movement. I would like to give an example here. Let's say modernism and postmodernism, there is a disjunction, there is a breakaway in postmodernism, but we also see a like plenty of overlaps between the two movements, and so a chronological continuum, which Franz Roh consciously wanted to avoid in this case, and hence not post-expressionism but magical realism. Right now, Ian Gwinter located magical realism as first coming from the German romantic philosopher Novalis. A novelist describes an ideal philosophical protagonist as capable of integrating the magical meanings with the ordinary phenomena, the everyday phenomena. So, the magic, like I said, is not a takeoff from the ordinary, but is interspersed with the ordinary and the mundane. So, for Novalis, absolute has both a subjective and an objective aspect, which unites realism with idealism. So, in this convergence, in this unity of realism and idealism, magical realism is born. So, magical idealism requires a complete control over the body and the soul. In other words, the external and internal senses. This is something that Novalis had to say. So, we see that in magical realism, it is through poetry that a magical idealist understands how to attain a magical change of the sensible world. We see Novalis using the term syncretism for the first time, and according to Novalis' doctrine, syncretism transforms conflict into spiritual, playful forms, which enables an understanding of correlation and comparison. So, when we have opposed categories, the traditionally dyadic dualistic categories, we are not looking at binarism, we are not looking at a clash or a kind of difference, but rather the magical that can emerge as a result of their interfacing. A novelist states that a magical idealist should have the power, to quote him, to make thoughts into things and things into thoughts, unquote. In other words, the soul externalizes itself in nature in the same way as the nature internalizes itself in the mind. So, the human nature and the outer nature interface, and the magic is sparked out of this interface. According to Franz Rowe, magical realism occupied this middle ground where the magical realist was neither the practical Machiavellian politician nor the apolitical man that listens only to the voice of an ethical. A magical realist should typically be at once political and yet ethical. Chris Warnes associates both novelists and Rowe's conceptualizations of magical realism with the limits of mimesis. How much can we imitate the world onto word? And the world, the discursive world with its arbitrary happenings, infinite meanings, cannot be exactly transcribed, brought into the page of an artwork, of a book, or into performance. There has to be a reliance on dialectics between the inwardness and the outwardness. The outer is interspersed, interwoven into our inner, and that's where the real becomes a magical real. Mayor Howard Abrams understands Expressionism as depicting, I quote, powerful emotional states of mind. So, we also need to understand the Expressionist movement which preceded the magical realism. So, art critic Frederick S. Levine also echoes Rowe in writing that Expressionism sought the personification of inner reality. So, reality not a ditto of the outer happenings, but something that reflects, that personifies our inner reality, the psychic reality too, and something that wanted to project emotional needs, psychological pressures, and private obsessions, unquote. So, expressionists are essentially reacting against realism by using highly structured schematics and exalted idealism, right. So, according to Franz Rowe, magical realism was a reaction, a takeoff from expressionism through producing a space where our real world reemerges before our eyes. So, coming back to the ordinary through the non-jaded vision. So, rather than seeking the infinite, the indefinite, and the transcendental remote meanings which underlay the definite frame, magical realism is more interested in cracking open, in dismantling, unpacking the definite, and thereby examining its effect on the humanity. So, Rowe refers to German artist Georg Schimm's painting in order to explain the double-sided art that strives between contraries, which is at the heart of magical realism. Here we see that the ordinary and the familiar can also refer to the spirit. So, we are looking at the capabilities, the capacities of the ordinary, and it can also speak to the question of the spiritual. The fact that we are not dealing with binaries anymore. So, ordinary is not a binary opposite to the spiritual. They can actually meet, and a magic can spark as a result. So, they are not diametrically opposed. Now, Gustav Hartlaub coined the term new objectivity in relation to magical realism as a way of defining this art movement. The term new objectivity suggests objectivism as a kind of spiritual creation. It offers a return to unsentimental reality and a focus on the objective world as opposed to the more abstract, more romantic and a more idealistic tendency that Expressionism harbors. So, in painting, new objectivity is most often associated with portraiture, and its leading practitioners. So, in painting, we see some of the leading practitioners of new objectivity include Max Beckmann, Otto Dix, and George Grosz. So, new objectivity has, since the time of these artists, formed a part of Latin American literature, post-colonial studies, and criticisms related to non-Western way of the world, the non-Western existence. So, the interest of new objectivity once again lay in the magic that inhabits which is inbuilt in the ordinary. So, as opposed to Expressionism, which was deeply invested with a sense of exoticism and which emphasized the fantastic, extraterrestrial and objects that are far away from our familiar world, remote objects. That was something that interested Expressionism. Apart from this, we see in new objectivity re-emergence from that dreamscape, coming back to the this worldly to the reality. So, re-emergence from dreamscape to the reality and celebrating the mundane as a way of, moving away from the transcendental and even the religious themes. Rowe calls this as a movement of decantation and clarification, and Rowe distinguishes Expressionism, Futurism and Post-Expressionism through the lens of objectivity. So, in Germany we see an interesting phenomenon where new objectivity frequently portrays Weimar society in a satirical manner. How new objectivity treats the post-World War I German society. So, the Weimar culture refers to arts and sciences produced in Germany during the interwar period. This is the period when we are talking about the defeat in World War I and the rise of Hitler. And this, the Weimar culture, Weimar society centers the 1920s Berlin. New objectivity, in other words, magical realism represents the contemporary realities at that time in Germany, the horrors of Germany, reflecting or representing the urban life, the dirty cities, machines, factories, and it drew concentration on the individual that is lost in a world which he can no longer understand and he cannot control. It is representing the external determinants, diminishing human possibilities, diminishing the human existence. Now, the Weimar culture is captured in new objectivity, portrays a Germany that is suffering from depression of defeat in World War I. It is talking about the economic inflation and the seething anger, cynicism and social division, all of which would eventually lead to the Second World War. It was celebrating a return to reality after Expressionism's, distortion of reality and all sorts of exaggerations that Expressionism indulged in. So, Expressionism was an existential flight, like we have already discussed by now, which touched the real world from a mystical perspective, a remote perspective, whereas magical realism makes a return to the real world. According to Massimo Bontempelli, who is an Italian poet, dramatist and critic, also a significant figure in the development of magical realism in Europe. So, according to Bontempelli, World War I created a tabula rasa from which a new era began. Bontempelli would go on to say that as humanity was starting afresh, starting anew with almost, it bargained a new lease of life after World War One, and one ought to feel elementary once again with this new start, new lease of life. One ought to feel elementary again and rebuild from this state of nothingness, create one's own myths which would help bind the people together. So, apart from novelist Anne Rowe, Bontempelli's magical realism reflects a desire for a new mythography, a new way of looking at the map, or a new sense of geography that take into consideration the connections between the past and the present. So, while the development of expressionist painting was marked by a moving away from the nature towards rejecting its representative, imitative meaning that informed the realist tradition, in futurism, the objective world appeared in an abrupt and dislocated form. And in post-expressionism, we see there is this desire, the aim to reintegrate reality into the heart of what is visible, what is tactile and tangible around us. So, recognizing and re-entering the real things, the ground in which the most diverse ideas in the world can take root, has been reconquered, albeit in new ways. Right? Franz Rowe argues that the deeper meaning and mysticism of expressionist artwork disturbs the secure tranquility. So, there are certain class assumptions, class associations with expressionist artwork we see. So, expressionism, as Rowe sees it, is fraught with vulgar bourgeoisification, whereas the labor class can appreciate an art that is sans grandeur, sans loftiness, and something that appeals to the civil by reflecting a sense of restraint, prudence, and discretion, and something that incorporates the experience of the monotony of hard labor. So, hard labor being represented in art reconciles the common people with the artistic process, the creation of art. So, magical realism believes in sobriety as a way of radiating magicality and spirituality. This is what Franz Rowe has to say. This, magicality emanating from the ordinary is possible through unlikely combinations of events that lead to the marvelous results, right? So, we see that modern and postmodern, going back to our earlier discussions, they are really interested in these unlikely combinations and the staccato effect, right? Where the harmony and the familiar, reading, the familiar perception is, kind of unnerved, dismantled, cracked open, and unsettled. So, we are shocked and we are forced to think afresh. As a departure from the artistic tradition of realism, which values empiricism, experimentation, observation, and transcribing that observation through descriptions on page, something that aims at creating art that is as true to the human experience as possible. So, effectively establishing the literary equivalent to anthropology, ethnography, and linguistics. On the other hand, expressionism sought to present what Rowe calls as the fantastic dreamscape. Now, the real in magical realism does not reproduce like a photo, not a photograph to its finest detail, but it is recreating the ordinary through a reconstruction of what Irene Guinter would call a spiritual reconstruction. So, this refers to mankind's constant oscillation between, I would quote Guinter here, devotion to the world of dreams and adherence to the world of reality. So, our attachment to both the worlds leads to a syncretism, which is the magical effect, the effect of the marvelous. In the words of Franz Roh, I quote, the marvel by which a variable commotion crystallizes into a clear set of constants. Magical realism delves into the impossible for a better exploration of the mundane and not in an attempt to destroy the mundane. So, approaching the mundane through alternative meanings. Magical and realism, when we juxtapose them, bring them together within the same term, it suggests an oxymoron that describes the new art. So, we are dealing with oppositions. As the term itself suggests, the movement is about what happens when two opposed categories meet, not always a conflict, but something really interesting. New meanings can emerge. So, magical realism is essentially constituted of these two parts, the expression of the magic or the impossible, the improbable within the conventions of literary realism. Thus, magical realism was a return to reality, but it carried the baggage of Expressionism's existential voyage to a certain extent, a mix of wild flights and anchored realities. Roh defines it as the treatment of the quotidian, the ordinary, as a product of the astonishingly inexplicable. Here we would like to stop our lecture and we will meet again with another round of discussions on the same topic. Thank you.